When Marilyn Monroe stepped off a plane in England in July 1956, Britain expected a glamorous visitor. What it got was a newlywed, a producer, and a media storm powerful enough to follow her across the Atlantic. She'd come to work with Laurence Olivier, one of Britain's most respected actors. But before filming was over, their partnership would become strained, her marriage would face intense scrutiny, and England would discover that Marilyn hadn't arrived simply to take direction. If you want to see the real Marilyn Monroe behind the headlines, tap like and subscribe. Because the moment her plane touched down, it became clear this wouldn't be an ordinary film shoot. Rain had already darkened the runway when Marilyn Monroe's plane reached London Airport on July 14, 1956. She stepped outside beside Arthur Miller, her husband of barely 2 weeks, and walked straight into chaos. Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh had come to welcome them. Police officers were waiting. Reporters had been given space to photograph the arrival. None of it held. The moment Marilyn appeared, photographers pushed forward. Reporters broke formation. The police line struggled to contain them. Hats and notebooks reportedly fell beneath people's feet, as grown men fought for a clear view of the woman they'd previously known only from movie screens. Marilyn was hurried toward the airport lounge, where a counter and police protection finally created enough distance for her to answer a few questions. Britain liked to think its press behaved with more restraint than Hollywood's. That afternoon, the distinction disappeared. One newspaper captured the mood with 4 blunt words: Marilyn sends 'em crazy. But the frenzy wasn't only about beauty. Standing beside Marilyn was Arthur Miller, one of America's most respected playwrights. Waiting to receive her was Laurence Olivier, the towering figure of British stage acting, and behind the cameras was a film partnership linking Hollywood money, British prestige, and Marilyn's newly won independence. It should have looked like a carefully planned international production. Instead, the first photographs showed Marilyn being swallowed by the attention she created, and that became the pattern of her months in England. Wherever she went, the machinery of celebrity arrived first. Her work, authority, and intentions came later, if they were noticed at all. The airport had already lost control. The next day, roughly 250 members of the press would squeeze into one room at the Savoy Hotel. And this time, Marilyn wouldn't have an airport counter to hide behind. The Savoy Hotel was built for elegance, not invasion. But on July 15th, its river room filled with reporters, photographers, and camera equipment. Marilyn Monroe was scheduled to appear beside Laurence Olivier and Arthur Miller, and almost every major British newspaper wanted a place inside. The press conference lasted around an hour. Marilyn sat beneath chandeliers while cameras crowded every possible angle. Olivier represented the production's British authority. Arthur represented literary seriousness. Marilyn was positioned between those worlds, but the room kept reacting to her, as if nobody else were there. Outside, fans waited for a glimpse. At one point, Marilyn appeared at the back of the hotel and waved to them. It was a small gesture, but it revealed why ordinary publicity rules didn't work around her. She didn't merely attend an event. Her presence changed the event's scale. Britain hadn't watched Hollywood arrive from a safe distance. Hollywood was now inside the Savoy. The flashbulbs, the shouting, the carefully arranged photographs, and the hunger for a headline had crossed the Atlantic with Marilyn. Even experienced British journalists found themselves competing for her attention. Yet the photographs created a misleading hierarchy. Olivier looked like the man in charge. Arthur looked like the important husband. Marilyn looked like the glamorous attraction they'd gathered to present. That picture was easy to understand, and newspapers could sell it immediately. What couldn't be seen was the contract behind the conference table. Marilyn hadn't come to England because Olivier had simply selected her for one of his films. She'd arrived with her own company attached to the production, and with rights her team had helped secure. The reporters kept asking about the newly married couple and the exciting partnership with Olivier. But the strongest part of Marilyn's position wasn't sitting beside her. It was printed on paperwork most photographers would never bother to shoot. Before that hidden story could emerge, however, Britain became absorbed by the marriage. Because Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller looked like a romance no headline writer could resist. Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller had married only a short time before flying to England. To the press, they seemed almost deliberately mismatched. She was the most recognizable blonde in Hollywood. He was the playwright behind Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. Marilyn was photographed wherever she went. Arthur looked more comfortable behind a typewriter than beneath a bank of flashbulbs. Newspapers reduced them to a simple contrast: glamour and intellect, beauty and brains, Hollywood and Broadway. It made irresistible copy, but it also turned their marriage into another public performance. Every look between them could become a romantic photograph. Every moment of distance could be treated as trouble. Even an ordinary walk through an airport became evidence for whatever story a newspaper wanted to tell. The pressure surrounding Arthur wasn't limited to his marriage. Only weeks earlier, he'd appeared before the House Committee on Un-American Activities in Washington. He answered questions about himself, but refused to identify other people. That decision placed him inside one of America's most heated political battles. So when Marilyn arrived in Britain, Hollywood gossip wasn't the only American story following her. Politics followed, marriage speculation followed. Questions about Arthur's reputation followed, and through it all, Marilyn was expected to smile, as though she'd come to England for a glamorous honeymoon with a film conveniently attached. There was tenderness between the newlyweds, and the early photographs capture real warmth. But Marilyn hadn't crossed the Atlantic merely as Arthur Miller's wife. She'd come to work. That distinction mattered because she'd spent years being introduced through the men around her: a studio executive, a director, a husband, or a powerful co-star. England now had another chance to make the same mistake. Behind the newlywed photographs was a woman carrying a business arrangement that challenged the Hollywood system she'd left behind. And once Marilyn Monroe Productions entered the story, the entire balance of power began to change. 2 years before Marilyn came to England, she'd done something Hollywood hadn't expected. She formed Marilyn Monroe Productions with photographer Milton Green. At the time, the decision was widely treated as a publicity stunt. Marilyn was still trapped inside the image the studio had built for her: the beautiful blonde who earned enormous money for other people while receiving limited control over her roles. Creating a company was her way of pushing back. It didn't free her from every contract, financier, or distributor. It didn't suddenly give her complete control, but it gave her leverage, and in the studio system of the 1950s, that was no small thing. Through Marilyn Monroe Productions, she moved toward material she actually wanted. The company acquired the screen rights to Terence Rattigan's play, The Sleeping Prince. That material became The Prince and the Showgirl. The finished film would be distributed by Warner Brothers. Laurence Olivier would direct and produce it. Milton Green served as executive producer. But Marilyn Monroe Productions was officially one of the production companies behind the picture. Even the copyright was registered in the company's name. That's the detail the airport photographs couldn't capture. The woman being pushed behind a counter by photographers wasn't just a celebrity arriving for someone else's movie. She was connected to the ownership of the material and the legal identity of the finished film. Her name wasn't only above the title, it was behind the picture. That didn't mean the production would run according to Marilyn's wishes. Power in filmmaking rarely belongs to one person. Olivier controlled the set, Warner Brothers controlled distribution, and money created its own demands. Still, Marilyn had moved into territory Hollywood had rarely allowed her to enter. She wasn't waiting for a studio executive to choose her next part. Her company had helped secure the story, build the partnership, and bring the film into production. But when Britain looked at the project, it didn't see a battle for Marilyn's independence. It saw Laurence Olivier preparing to teach a Hollywood star how serious acting was done. And that misunderstanding was about to enter Pinewood Studios with them. On paper, the pairing was perfect. Laurence Olivier carried the authority of the British stage. He'd performed Shakespeare, directed major films, and built a reputation as one of the finest actors of his generation. Marilyn Monroe carried a different kind of power. She could turn an airport arrival into national news. Her face sold magazines, tickets, and fantasies around the world. She didn't need a theater critic to explain her effect on an audience. The cameras recorded it every time she entered a room. Olivier would play the European regent in The Prince and the Showgirl. Marilyn would play Elsie Marina, an American performer pulled into a stiff royal world. He would also direct and produce. At the Savoy, they smiled beside each other, as though British theatrical tradition and Hollywood stardom had formed an effortless alliance. but the very qualities that made the partnership exciting also made it unstable. Olivier believed in preparation that could be controlled and repeated. He came from a stage culture in which an actor delivered on schedule, hit the mark, and performed despite whatever might be happening privately. Marilyn's process had moved in another direction. After years of being told to pose, smile, and appear sexy on command, she'd begun searching for something more truthful. She'd studied at the Actors Studio in New York and worked with teachers connected to method acting. She wanted to understand what her character felt before deciding how the character should move or speak. To Marilyn, that preparation was part of taking acting seriously. To Olivier, it could look slow, uncertain, and unnecessarily dependent on outside reassurance. At first, those differences remained hidden behind polished publicity photographs. But once the cameras began rolling, patience started disappearing. Olivier expected Marilyn to trust his direction. Marilyn needed to trust the emotion behind the scene. They'd come to Pinewood to make the same movie. The problem was that they hadn't agreed on what acting was. The trouble at Pinewood didn't begin with one enormous argument. It began with mistrust. Laurence Olivier knew the Sleeping Prince intimately. He'd performed the male lead on stage, and now controlled the film as its director, producer, and co-star. He understood the character, the rhythm, and the world of the story before Marilyn Monroe entered the soundstage. Marilyn was starting from somewhere else. She needed to discover why Elsie Marina behaved as she did. She wanted each reaction to feel emotionally honest, even if that meant stopping to question a line Olivier considered perfectly clear. To Olivier, acting was a craft that should remain dependable under pressure. The lights switched on, the camera rolled, and the trained actor delivered. Marilyn's process could look uncertain from the outside. She might ask about a character's motivation, struggle during rehearsals, or fail to repeat a movement exactly as Olivier expected. Then the camera would find something alive in the performance. But Olivier had a schedule to protect. Each pause cost time. Each retake increased pressure. What Marilyn viewed as preparation, Olivier increasingly viewed as obstruction. At one point, he reportedly gave her a blunt direction that amounted to simply being sexy. For Marilyn, those words struck the exact wound she'd come to England hoping to escape. Hollywood had spent years asking her to enter a room, display the famous image, and let the camera do the rest. She hadn't formed a company, studied acting, and crossed the Atlantic to hear the same instruction from Britain's most respected actor. Olivier may have intended it as practical direction. Marilyn heard it as proof that he still didn't see what she was trying to become. From that point, their disagreement wasn't only about technique. It was about whether Marilyn's preparation deserved respect at all. And when she no longer trusted the man directing her, she relied even more heavily on the woman standing just beyond his camera. Paula Strasberg. Her presence would turn a difficult partnership into a three-way struggle for control. Paula Strasberg wasn't simply another member of Marilyn Monroe's entourage. She was the person Marilyn trusted to help her reach a performance. Paula was married to Lee Strasberg, the influential teacher connected with the Actors Studio in New York. Marilyn had studied with Lee and had begun treating acting as something deeper than memorizing lines and hitting marks. At Pinewood, Paula remained close. Marilyn consulted her about dialogue, emotion, and the meaning of individual scenes. If Marilyn felt uncertain, she looked toward Paula for reassurance before turning back to Olivier. That placed Olivier in an impossible position, or at least, that's how he saw it. He was the film's official director. Yet his leading actress repeatedly checked his guidance against the opinion of her private coach. Every consultation could feel like a challenge to his authority. Marilyn saw it differently. She'd spent years surrounded by directors who wanted the familiar blonde image, without caring how exposed or frightened she felt while creating it. Paula gave her a sense of protection. Removing that support wouldn't necessarily make Marilyn faster. It might leave her unable to perform at all. So the set developed two centers of authority. Olivier controlled the cameras, crew, and schedule. Paula controlled the trust Marilyn needed before stepping in front of them. Neither side wanted to surrender. Olivier's frustration became harder to hide. Marilyn sensed his impatience, which made her more anxious. That anxiety increased her reliance on Paula, which frustrated Olivier even further. The pattern fed itself. This wasn't the playful conflict audiences would later see between a prince and a showgirl. It was a real struggle between a director trying to finish his film and an actress trying to protect the process she believed made her better. And every time that struggle delayed filming, the cost increased. Soon, the disagreement could no longer remain behind Pinewood's gates. Reporters were already waiting for proof that Marilyn Monroe couldn't survive beside Laurence Olivier. The production was about to give them all the material they needed. Filming began in early August 1956. By the time production ended in November, stories about Marilyn Monroe's behavior had become nearly as famous as the film itself. She arrived late. She sometimes struggled with lines. She missed marks and required repeated takes. Crew members waited while Marilyn prepared, and Laurence Olivier's patience wore thin. There's no need to pretend those problems weren't real. They disrupted the schedule and placed pressure on people responsible for completing an expensive international production. But the press didn't treat them as production problems. It treated them as a verdict on Marilyn Monroe. Every delay seemed to confirm the same old story. She wasn't disciplined, she wasn't dependable, and she didn't belong beside a serious actor like Olivier. His frustration became evidence of professionalism. Her difficulty became evidence of personal failure. That difference mattered. Marilyn wasn't simply walking onto a set and refusing to work. She was trying to perform while caught between anxiety, a demanding acting process, a new marriage, intense press attention, and a director she increasingly believed didn't respect her. None of that erased the delays. But it changed what those delays meant. A troubled working day could be described honestly without turning Marilyn into a joke. Instead, accounts of the production often became another story about a brilliant man being forced to endure a difficult woman. The irony was that Hollywood had always demanded something almost impossible from her. Marilyn had to appear completely natural while every detail was controlled. She had to seem carefree, while dozens of people waited for her to produce an effect worth millions. And if fear interrupted that process, the fear itself became public entertainment. At Pinewood, those contradictions finally became impossible to hide. Olivier saw the wasted hours. The crew saw the repeated takes. The newspapers saw a spectacle. But the camera recorded something none of them could measure while standing on the set. And once the successful takes were placed together, the supposed disaster began to look very different. A film camera doesn't remember how long it waited. It doesn't record the arguments that happened before a scene, or the number of failed takes that came first. It records what's finally placed in front of it. And when Marilyn Monroe found the moment Olivier needed, the camera responded. Her performance as Elsie Marina feels lighter and more intimate than the rigid royal world surrounding her. She listens. She reacts. A thought appears on her face before the line explaining it arrives. That kind of acting can seem small from the other side of a soundstage. On screen, it becomes enormous. Olivier's performance is controlled and technically polished. But beside Marilyn, that control can feel deliberately stiff, which suits the character, even if it makes the contrast between them sharper. Marilyn brings warmth into the frame. The surprising part isn't that she needed repeated takes. It's that after all the fear, tension, and mistrust, she still produced a performance with humor and emotional detail. That doesn't mean every scene works perfectly. It doesn't erase the frustration she caused, and it doesn't turn the production into a secret success story where nobody suffered. It means the finished work deserves to be judged separately from the gossip created during filming. Years later, much of the discussion would remain focused on Olivier's complaints, Marilyn's lateness, and the tension surrounding Paula Strasberg. But the film preserved something the daily stories couldn't. Marilyn Monroe belonged in the picture. She wasn't merely surviving beside a respected British actor. In many scenes, she was the person the camera understood most clearly. That was the contradiction at the center of her career. The process could be painful, uncertain, and exhausting. The final image could feel effortless. Yet even when filming ended for the day, Marilyn couldn't completely step outside that image. She and Arthur Miller had a house away from central London, near quiet roads and open countryside. It should have offered privacy. Instead, it became another place where Britain waited to see what Marilyn Monroe would do next. Parkside House stood in Englefield Green, near Windsor. Compared with the Savoy Hotel and Pinewood Studios, it seemed almost ordinary. There were trees, narrow roads, and enough distance from central London to create the appearance of privacy. Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller stayed there during production. For the newlyweds, the house offered something the hotels and press conferences couldn't, a front door they could close. But privacy around Marilyn was always temporary. Photographers found the couple there. Newspapers turned their domestic life into another feature. When the Daily Sketch presented Marilyn and Arthur with bicycles, the gift quickly produced a new set of photographs. Now Britain had another version of Marilyn to consume. Not the gold-gowned star. Not the anxious actress at Pinewood. The American newlywed in the English countryside, smiling beside her husband with a bicycle. The pictures looked relaxed, but they were still pictures created for public attention. Even far from Hollywood, Marilyn's life kept arranging itself into scenes. That's what had followed her to England. Not simply reporters or flashbulbs, but the demand that every part of her life become an image. A marriage became a headline. A country house became a photo location. A bicycle became publicity. Still, Englefield Green placed Marilyn close to something genuinely new. Windsor Castle was only a short distance away. The Queen regularly used it, placing Marilyn physically close to a world she'd previously known only through ceremony and newspapers. The contrast was almost too perfect. At Pinewood, Marilyn played an American entertainer entering European royalty. At Parkside House, she lived near one of the world's most famous royal residences. And before she left England, the fictional story and the real one would cross. Marilyn Monroe would be invited into a formal receiving line at the royal film performance. This time, Laurence Olivier wouldn't be playing the royal figure. Queen Elizabeth II would be standing directly in front of her. On October 29, 1956, Marilyn Monroe entered the Empire Theatre in Leicester Square for the royal film performance. The featured movie was The Battle of the River Plate. It wasn't Marilyn's film. She hadn't appeared in it, and she wasn't there to promote her own performance. She'd been invited as one of the international figures representing the film industry. That distinction mattered. 3 months earlier, British reporters had nearly overwhelmed Marilyn at the airport. Now she stood inside one of the country's most controlled public ceremonies, waiting in a carefully arranged line to meet Queen Elizabeth II. Marilyn wore a fitted gold lame gown with a low neckline, matching cape and long gloves. Against the dark suits and restrained evening clothes surrounding her, the fabric caught every flash. The photographers reacted exactly as expected. Once again, Marilyn became the night's most visible story, even though the event belonged to someone else's film. But when the Queen reached her, Marilyn didn't behave like the careless outsider later headlines would suggest. She performed a formal curtsy, rose, accepted the Queen's hand, and spoke with her briefly. The surviving footage is silent, but the movement is clear. There's no public reprimand, no visible confrontation, and no disruption to the receiving line. Marilyn was also presented to Princess Margaret. Within one evening, the woman who'd arrived in Britain amid airport chaos had moved through one of its most formal institutions. Hollywood glamour now stood directly beside royal tradition, and the contrast created photographs that would last far longer than the conversation. Yet the most interesting part of the evening wasn't Marilyn's gown. It was how closely the real scene resembled the story she was filming at Pinewood. For months, Marilyn had been playing an American entertainer surrounded by European royalty, rigid ceremony, and rules she hadn't created. Now the showgirl had stepped into the real version. And suddenly, the film's plot no longer looked like fiction alone. The Prince and the Showgirl takes place in London in 1911, during preparations for the coronation of King George V. Marilyn Monroe plays Elsie Marina, an American performer who becomes involved with the Regent of Carpathia, played by Laurence Olivier. Elsie enters a world of uniforms, titles, palace rooms, and carefully guarded behavior. She's treated as an outsider, but her openness disrupts the stiffness around her. The role was almost too perfectly suited to what Marilyn was experiencing in England. She'd entered British filmmaking with her own habits, teachers, and expectations. Olivier represented tradition, discipline, and authority. Marilyn represented a newer kind of screen acting, more intimate, less predictable, and built for the camera rather than the stage. In the film, Elsie's apparent lack of sophistication causes powerful people to underestimate her. Behind the camera, something similar was happening to Marilyn. The press treated her as the glamorous American visiting Olivier's production. Crew stories often placed him at the center and described Marilyn as the problem orbiting him. But the business arrangement told another story. Marilyn's company had helped secure the material. Her name carried the international audience the production needed, and her performance supplied the warmth that kept the royal comedy from becoming completely rigid. Then life created the final echo. Elsie entered a fictional royal setting. Marilyn entered the Empire Theater and stood before a real queen. In both scenes, the surface suggested that Marilyn was visiting a world controlled by someone else. Yet outside the camera frame, she was trying to build authority of her own. That's why the production records matter. Photographs show who attracted attention. Contracts show who held a position. And when filming finally ended, the credits would preserve something the gossip couldn't erase. Marilyn Monroe hadn't merely appeared in Laurence Olivier's film. Laurence Olivier had also appeared in a film backed by Marilyn Monroe Productions. Production continued into November 1956. By then, the partnership between Marilyn Monroe and Laurence Olivier had produced frustration neither side could hide. The film had taken longer and demanded more patience than Olivier expected. But it was finished. On November 20th, Marilyn left Britain, a little more than 4 months after the chaotic airport arrival that had announced her presence. The reporters could summarize those months through lateness, disagreements, gowns, and marriage speculation. The completed film recorded something more permanent. Laurence Olivier was its director, producer, and male star. Warner Brothers handled distribution. Terrence Rattigan wrote the screenplay from his stage play. And Marilyn Monroe Productions remained officially attached to the picture. The copyright was registered in the company's name. That didn't mean Marilyn controlled every part of the film. She didn't control Olivier's direction, the distributor, or the final public reaction. Independent production still depended on powerful partners. But she'd crossed a line that Hollywood had spent years keeping in place. The studio system wanted stars to remain valuable faces inside projects selected and controlled by other people. Marilyn had used the value of her face to help place her company behind a project. That difference can disappear in photographs. A glamorous premiere image doesn't show who purchased material. An airport crowd doesn't show who negotiated a production arrangement. A picture of Marilyn standing beside Olivier doesn't explain why her company's name appears in the legal record. Paperwork isn't glamorous. But paperwork is where power leaves fingerprints. Marilyn had come to England hoping to prove she was more than the character Hollywood repeatedly sold. The production had exposed her vulnerabilities, tested her marriage, and placed her under punishing attention. It had also reached completion with her company still attached. Now the public would see the finished picture, and the woman accused of being unable to work beside Britain's finest actor was about to receive a professional judgment the production gossip hadn't predicted. The Prince and the Showgirl was released in 1957. The response wasn't universally enthusiastic. The film's ceremonial pace could feel stiff, and the tension between Marilyn Monroe's intimate screen style and Laurence Olivier's controlled theatrical approach remained visible. But that contrast didn't destroy Marilyn's performance. It often strengthened it. She appears relaxed where the royal characters are rigid. Her reactions feel immediate. Even when Elsie doesn't control the room, Marilyn controls where the viewer looks. Then came the recognition. At the 1958 BAFTA Film Awards, Marilyn Monroe was nominated for Best Foreign Actress for The Prince and the Showgirl. The same production also received nominations for Laurence Olivier's performance, Terrence Rattigan's screenplay, Best British Film, and Best Film from Any Source. 5 BAFTA nominations emerged from the film remembered for delays, mistrust, and arguments over acting. Marilyn didn't need the nomination to prove every criticism wrong. The problems at Pinewood had happened. Olivier's frustration had been real, and Marilyn's working process had placed serious strain on the production. But the nomination exposed the weakness in the easiest version of the story. A difficult actress can still be a gifted actress. A troubled production can still contain strong work. And an actor who needs repeated takes can still produce the performance audiences remember, after everyone has forgotten how many attempts it required. The British film establishment hadn't simply tolerated Marilyn Monroe. It nominated her work. That was a far more meaningful judgment than any tabloid description of her behavior. But England's final importance in Marilyn's story can't be measured by one nomination. the larger result was already visible. She'd brought a project connected to her own company across the Atlantic, completed it beside one of the world's most respected actors, and survived 4 months in which nearly everything she did became public property. Hollywood had followed her to England, yet it hadn't managed to keep her in the old position. Marilyn Monroe came to England hoping to make a film. What followed her was much larger. The photographers followed, the gossip followed, the questions about her marriage followed. Hollywood's old assumption that Marilyn needed to be managed followed her directly through the gates of Pinewood Studios. Even the instruction to rely on sex appeal followed her. Crossing the Atlantic hadn't allowed Marilyn to leave her famous image behind. If anything, England proved how powerful that image had become. It could overwhelm an airport, fill the Savoy, dominate a royal premiere, and pull attention away from everyone standing nearby. But Marilyn had brought something else with her. She brought her acting preparation. She brought Paula Strasberg, despite Olivier's objections. She brought material her company had helped secure. And she brought a legal and professional identity that existed behind the photographs. England didn't magically solve Marilyn's struggle for control. The production remained painful. Her new marriage faced pressure. Her working difficulties didn't disappear, and her company couldn't protect her from every decision made by more powerful partners. But the trip exposed the difference between Marilyn Monroe, the product, and Marilyn Monroe, the working woman. The product was easy to photograph. The woman was harder to understand. She could be late and still be talented, vulnerable and still determined, dependent on reassurance while fighting for independence. She could arrive as the most recognizable actress in the world and still demand the right to become something more. That's why Hollywood followed her. It couldn't afford to look away. Yet for once, Hollywood wasn't the only force deciding where the camera would point. Marilyn had helped choose the material, helped create the production, and placed her company's name behind the finished film. She came to England as an image the world believed it already understood. She left with her name in the credits, and a performance that survived the people who complained about how difficult it had been to capture. If you believe Marilyn Monroe's real story lives beyond the gossip, tap like and subscribe. Because the photographs show us the star, but the records reveal the woman who was fighting to own her future.